Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Nucleus Wealth Investment Insights. The topic for today is the future of energy. We're going to look at some new emerging technologies, the state of solar, where we're at with batteries, and what the energy industry might look like in the future. Then, as always, we'll discuss our investment implications for Australia and around the world. My name's Sam Kerr, and I'm the Senior Advisor at Nucleus Wealth, and I'll be the host of the show for today. As always, we have the Head of Investments, Damien Klassen. Damien, great to have you here as usual. How are you getting on today?
Thanks very well, Sam. Good to have you on again.
Excellent. And also our guest on the show for today is Bruce Thompson from Greensync. So Bruce has 25 years experience in renewables and energy efficiency, which has been focused on integration and scaling the uptake of small-scale technologies such as solar, PV, and batteries. He's been an executive with Greensync for the last 5 years, leading the commercial side of the business. Bruce, it's a pleasure to have you here today. How are you today?
Really good. Great to join you both.
Excellent. So just a quick reminder before we get started. If you enjoy our content, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell to be notified when we go live or have a new episode recorded that you can watch. Alternatively, follow us on your preferred podcast platform. Our show is available on all the majors. For those of you listening live, feel free to drop your questions in the YouTube live stream chat, and we'll do our best to answer them during the show. Now that we've got that little bit of housekeeping out of the way, we'll get into things. So Bruce, on your website, it states that Greensync is a global energy tech company committed to digitally enabling renewable energy for a better world. Do you mind just explaining what that actually means and tell us a bit about Greensync?
Yeah, for sure. Well, so our world is in our world we call it distributed energy resources, but what we generally know is that there's solar panels now increasingly on our roof. They're a battery down the side of the house or an electric vehicle in our garage, as well as what's increasingly a plethora of smart devices in our homes, from white goods that are all internet enabled. We have a platform called DEX. It's really short for Distributed Energy Exchange. And what that does is, just like a phone exchange, what we're trying to solve is an ability to have a standard way to register those devices in a way that can enable those devices to be safe for grid connection, where they're providing a major injection to the grid, like a solar panel or a battery, where they're drawing a large amount of load, like an electric vehicle when it's charging, to meet the safety requirements of the grid, so that we can avoid some critical constraints, but ultimately open them up for retailers to actually start to aggregate those systems at volume. And really, where those retailers are participating in electricity markets is be able to optimize the use of those systems for the benefit of their customer base. So that's what we do. We're basically like a big telephone exchange for the equivalent of mobile phones that are now sort of starting to become common in our homes and in our businesses.
And I think just to put it from my perspective, the big reason for getting Bruce on, we've obviously run a whole series of these over the last sort of 4 or 5 years of various things looking into the energy sector, and our take's obviously been that solar plus batteries are sort of the killer app of this energy world, and at the right prices is extremely scalable, but we're not there yet, everywhere around the world, and it's really this question about what are the steps that are going to get us there, and how long does that take. And so, the big reason for getting Bruce on was to talk about some of the technology and what we're seeing in terms of prices, because in our mind, I guess we look at solar and say, well, solar on its own in a sunny country is, if it's not the cheapest, it's very close to the cheapest out there. And so now the big issue is, obviously the sun doesn't shine all the time, and you need to get battery costs down. And if you get battery costs low enough and solar keeps drifting away, then all of a sudden you've got no more need for a lot of these other technologies. And so it's a question about, is that going to take us 20 years or 30 years, or is it going to take us 5 years? And so varies by country, but I guess I might open that by then. So your thoughts on, in terms of solar. It seems to me that the solar costs themselves have sort of come down so far that it's low enough now that a 10% change doesn't actually make that much difference to the overall cost of solar, and it's more about the battery cost. I mean, is that sort of the way you look at it, or how do you sort of see the whole?
Yeah, look, I think that's right. We passed this amazing number last week. 3 million homes now have solar systems installed. So we've got 1 in 3 houses across Australia with solar on their roof. In some states, that's even higher. In Western Australia and Queensland, you're actually getting heading towards 1 in 2 systems in some suburbs. So phenomenally successful, and Australia has been a really big success story. We're really ahead by per capita of any other country in the world, but in some cases we're just ahead on pure numbers. I was talking to some colleagues this morning in the UK, and I think that, I'm not sure if this is right, but I think we installed more solar in the last 4 months in Australia than there are systems installed in the UK outright. It's been phenomenally successful, and it's because there has been rightfully a level of subsidisation from various federal and state governments over that period of time, but the supply chain has really worked, and it's worked in a really quite an interesting way in Australia. The install costs in Australia are about a quarter of what the installed cost is in the US.
Right.
So in California, which is, it's got very proactive renewable policies, quite an active customer base that's demanding that technology. And so when we come back to the actual equipment costs, it's actually not necessarily the material factor. Now, you could argue that it is more material in Australia, where we've actually stripped down and actually has been a real cost has really driven the market in reduction, and it's been a very competitive market, quite a cutthroat market, I think, over the last 5 years. But I think it's fair to say it's at a point now where you're right. It's a marginal, those supply chain issues that solar panels are going through in the last 6 months may impact at the 10%. But the average deal is still really quite attractive for a household. You can get a system on your roof for less than $5,000. You can get a fairly comfortable payback within 5 years. And so I think we'll just see that growth continue.
And the difference in cost between Australia and the US, what do you put that down to in terms of the install cost?
Look, there's a number of factors. There's a higher level of, I think, roughly red tape in terms of approvals processes, the requirements that are involved in actually doing the design specification. There's higher cost for install. I think there's a different approach to installation, which has driven up the costs. I think there's also just a fundamental volume issue that hasn't actually really sort of productized and been able to get those systems going as they have in Australia. Now that will clearly change, especially over this big policy shifts from the Biden administration, as well as some of the larger players now, large solar aggregators that are moving. But one of the phenomenal stories in Australia is it's the least aggregated or consolidated, I should say, service. I think really we don't have. I think the largest solar installer still has perhaps less than 5% of the market share. And so, whereas that's quite different in some other jurisdictions, there's 1, 2, 3 sort of major players that are actually doing that installation.
And so is that sort of just a matter of competition? Then you think that oligopolistic, can't even get it out. That monopolistic pricing. Let's put it that way. And is in some places.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not.
These are your customers.
Qualified to comment. I think it is a number of factors. I think, and we'll talk perhaps later about how that market may change in Australia. But I think it has been, that small companies, small businesses, small electrical contractors have been able to tool up, to be able to train up and be able to put these systems in. And that's been, quite successful for some small business operators. And the way that the market and the wholesalers have been structured has really allowed them to do that. And we do have quite a diversity of product as well. We have from the inverters, which is the key sort of smarts. You get the panels on the roof, and then the inverters, the real brains of the capital cost. In Australia, we have something like 10 major brands that are competing, whereas in the US, 80% of the market's with two inverter manufacturers. So
Right.
yeah, there's, I guess, a number of those dynamics which have led to the Australian story.
Prices. Now, in terms of the battery side, because I guess that's where I'm seeing that, that's where if you're a techno optimist, that's where you're hoping you'll see the next sort of some quite significant decreases in terms of the costs there. And from other people who've spoken to, it seems that there's very much a divergence now in terms of technology, in terms of the your car. The technology that's driving your electric cars is turning to be quite different to the technology that's there to power houses, just in terms of the power needs. Is that, I guess, would you agree with that? And what do you see in terms of cost sides?
Well, I think so. What the big driver is still really around lithium. We've seen, lithium has become the technology really of choice, and I think for the next 5 to 10 years, it has dominated. It's come out of a lot of mobile devices, electronics, as both its power to energy density and how much energy it can store within a small footprint and within a light footprint, and that's obviously translating now to electric vehicles. From a household's perspective, to get a system on the side of your house, it's still $10,000 to $15,000. So it's a big upfront capital cost, but the economics don't actually work the same way as they do for solar. The battery doesn't quite still have that killer payback that the solar does outright, and so. From the work I do, the conundrum is we need actually more batteries to actually balance out the variability that we have in the grid. But from a customer's perspective, it's still not quite there as stacking up in the same way that solar does. So the big question now is the battery that people will buy, will it have wheels on it? Will electric vehicles and that interoperability between that car in the garage, the car that's not being used for 95% of its life, it's just sitting in a driveway or sitting in a parking lot, will that actually be, if we can enable those systems to be actually to displace just a static battery?
Yeah, because and the thing that I sort of wonder on that front is that battery, the range anxiety seems to be a big thing in cars, and you speak to people all the time, and the issue's like, oh yeah, but what happens if I want to go 600 kilometers, and will it do it, and all this type of stuff? And you're like, well, yeah, but people generally travel 20, 30 kilometers a day at most, and so that doesn't seem to be an issue. But I guess I wonder if people are going to have that same range anxiety is like, well, yeah, you could take 10% of my battery, but what happens if I really needed it, and I needed to drive somewhere and I didn't have it? I just wonder if that same anxiety will permeate into the, no, you can't use I want my car fully charged type thing. I don't know.
Yeah, look, I think this is really at that early adopter stage, which is really moving through. I think all of the stories you hear is those are anxieties from people who haven't driven an EV, and I think when you drive one, when you're using one, the battery is about 4 times the size of the standard residential battery on wheels. We only use them about 5% of the time, and most of us in urban areas only drive those sort of 30 kilometers. Now, certainly there's people like me who loves to get away on the weekend camping, and I can't afford the EV of my dreams, but it's coming soon. People might have seen there's the General Motors launched the F-150 all electric last week. There's I think the darling of the startup world in the US is a company called Rivian that's really chasing after that RV market. So they won't be killing the weekend, but here today they really are. I think at that point for urban commuting, I think they will really transform people's lives. Now we've all gone through. People maybe of my age have all gone through having your first car and running out of petrol. And you only do that once, I think, and so I think it's probably a similar experience. There will be some of those teething problems and user experiences that come up, but EVs I think everyone knows are definitely coming, and they've got the functionality, I think the usability and that capability. Certainly with the generation of models that are coming out now that are north of 500 kilometers range.
Yeah, and am I right in saying then, so that a problem you're looking to solve is this idea that if you can, if you could have 10,000 batteries sort of sitting under your software, then you'll be able to sell it back to the grid instead of gas peaking plants and stuff like that at the right time, because you can say, yes, we'll turn on, across Melbourne or across Sydney or whatever, we'll turn on 1,000 houses and pour that energy back out to the grid, so that you don't have to start up a gas-fired power plant somewhere in the Hunter Valley. Is that the type of thing you're looking for?
Yeah, look, that's right. And look, and I think as Sam said in the intro, I've been in renewables for about 25 years. I'm very passionate about the mission, about being 100% renewable. The reality is that it's not sunny when it's not sunny, and it's not windy when it's not windy. I think there's a new German term now called Dunkelflotter, which basically means the dark lull. But the flip side is that there are points in time, and a lot of the focus our technology is supporting at the moment is we're having quite the opposite now. We're having peaks of solar during the middle of the day. In South Australia, we have hit records all this year, especially during spring, where it's very sunny, but there's just not that demand on the system. So we fundamentally come back to electricity is very much about real-time supply and demand. And it's really the conundrum that we need to solve is that renewables are inherently variable and intermittent. And so that's where we know, though, that the renewable hardware is actually cheaper. It's now cost competitive without subsidies, and that will just continue to roll, both at large-scale wind and solar, as well as the domestic uptake of rooftop PV. But with that, our role, along with other technologies, is to make those things smarter. And so we need a combination of digital technology to be able to automate when things turn on and off, to make it a set and forget from a customer perspective. And then we need to be able to deal with storage to be able to displace fossil fuels. Now, fossil fuels are clearly pretty bad, but they are really good at storing energy, and that's one of the hard things that we've had as an industry to be able to transition to.
I guess where I'm leading with that question to hone you in a little bit more is okay, if I'm a homeowner and I'm looking and saying, okay, I can I stick some batteries on the side of my house. That means I don't have to pay for electricity in the evening, which is a little bit more expensive than during the day and all that type of stuff. And I go, yeah, okay, I've got a certain payback on it. But if I'm giving, say, half of that battery capacity to someone like yourself to say, okay, you go and sell it when the energy really wants, when the system really needs it, you'll get what, 10, 20, 100 times more than what I'm going to get for it. And so maybe that sort of turns the equation in from maybe the battery costs don't need to fall as far if I can give it to somebody who's going to be displacing peaker plants rather than displacing my own, evening load. Is that the right path here?
Absolutely, because with supply and demand comes, we've got a spot market price for that wholesale value at that point in time, what's it worth? And then we've also got ancillary services. There's some exotic things, and especially batteries can provide to the grid to provide ability for system security and reliability. And through the ability for an aggregator or a retailer to be able to manage those systems on behalf of the customer, you've got to be able to optimize it to make sure that electric car that we're talking about has got enough charging in it for you to get to the shops or pick the kids up from sport. But at the same time, if you've got that capacity, then there is a series of retailers, and we're just providing the technology, so we're not a market participant. We provide that technology for companies that are looking to trade those residential systems in aggregate into the market at those higher price points.
But I guess so how far away are we from having this as there's two questions involved, I guess. One is, if the technology sort of was pretty close to perfect, are we already at a price point where it would actually start making sense for everyone to get a battery, because they'll make money from selling it back to the grid, and that'll make it a no-brainer? Or do we still need both the technology to improve and price falls before it turns into a no-brainer?
Well, and there's a couple of other dynamics I'll add. So yeah, look, absolutely. There's the upfront capital cost, which, as we're talking about, for the batteries, is still it's a little bit high for that more discretionary purchase, but certainly we'll see those hardware costs come down. Every graph that's out there in the industry really says that the actual battery sticker cost will decrease. The conundrum that we have, especially when we're putting those technologies into households, is a household grappling with both the capital cost, but the inability to necessarily trade that or get a certainty of the value of that system over a period of time. So we've got a spot market, very it's a very near real time price, but then a very lumpy capital cost that we're looking to try and get a return on over its warranty life, which might be about 10 or 15 years. So technology is rapidly advancing, and there's folks that are into computers like us that are working to make each of those systems be able to be more plug and play. But one of the interesting challenges, I think, will be around financing of those systems, where systems and maybe some of the new retailers, and I think some of the large incumbents, are really looking at how do we finance those systems into households, that we're part of that asset leasing that's providing the household benefit. The service is really, at the end of the day, what everyone's after is keep the lights on at a low cost, increasingly knowing that that's green, but not necessarily. I think that the challenge is who will own those assets and how they can be actually financed to better actually trade that wider market benefit.
And so is that the part where, as you're saying, it might be that you'll come along and go, okay, rather than 15 grand, you give me 5 grand for the battery, I'll pay the other 10, but I need to be able to, take it down to whatever, 50% if I need to, whenever I want. Is that the type of?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there's been a number of third-party financing offers in solar, and they really haven't been taken up that readily. Partly because the cost has sort of come down to people go through the motions during the sales process, the finance is offered there, and then people end up putting it on their card.
Right.
We are seeing a greater maturity and interest from banks in being able to bundle those with with the mortgage as a mechanism. Now, again, that wasn't in my experience hasn't been taken up so readily over the last decade, but it's reasonable to assume that as we get into a much more mainstream uptake of those products, that will be reasonable. I think the holy grail is potentially how that might get bundled with your retailer, so that it is actually there's a reinforcing alignment between having that overall responsibility for the service of your electricity. And just like we see with bundling of handsets for mobile phones, those kind of products are now very standard, and they are a way to actually link the actual use of the service to the cost of the asset. We're starting to see that, I think. So we've got companies like Discover Energy, which are born out of a solar wholesaler, one of the largest wholesalers of the solar PV panels and inverters and now batteries to a lot of installers across Australia. Set up a retailer. There's a company like Amber, who's in our room, very much a digital native company that's got a retail license that's done a deal with one of the banks to get green loans. And then we've got a company called Bright that's come from financing, has some major investment from Mike Cannon-Brookes, and they've just got a retailer license. So I think those models will be quite interesting, because they'll go from the very disparate solar installers, the electrical contractors doing this quite independent of who your retailer is, to starting to bring those deals together.
Well, and that's that part where with a lot of car companies, over the last 10, 15 years, have sort of had that part where the finance division actually makes better profits than the car companies. It's almost basically we're a finance company, and we just need an asset to sell in order to collect interest on it. And so maybe that's I've often wondered as to at what stage that turns into that same type of model, as you said. You just, we don't care whether we're selling a car or a solar panel or a battery or whatever it is. We just need something to sell to in order to give people finance and collect money. Yes. Okay, and
so Bruce, we've just got a viewer question here. I'll just elaborate on the question a little bit. So batteries and solar, they're obviously green technologies, which are displacing sort of less environmentally friendly means of electricity production. So the question is, who's responsible for the disposal of the batteries? And does the components that go into making the batteries and then the disposal, does that detract from the green image that solar and batteries have?
Look, it's a very important question. I mean, I think in anything that we have, the what we call the life cycle impact of that, the full end to end is, is something that needs to be counted. We as a global community are grappling with managing that impact. We don't want to be in out of the frying pan and into the fire situation. But the drivers for, I think, globally at a political level and at an economy level are really dramatic if we don't shift away from fossil fuels. We're going to, through all of the supply chains, whether it's batteries, vehicles, our toaster, all of those things need to be increasingly taking into account the life cycle impacts of those provisions. And it is true that a lot of these products have rare earth materials that are involved, and they do have impacts at site during the mining process and during extraction, as well as disposal. Now, there's a lot of people that are putting a lot of work into R&D to improve those processes or be able to provide materials that are alternative to that. I think we've got, I'm very confident that we've got the right focus as an industry to be able to drive that improvement and I think get the right market responses. Specifically for the batteries, it's a thing we're going to have to grapple with, because we're going to actually have a significant increase in volume for electric vehicles. Uptake of lithium is going to be really, really driven by an explosion in EV purchases over the next 5 years. And we will need to factor into that recycling programs. There's a great startup here in Melbourne, in Australia, called Re-Electrify, which is working on technologies to be able to take batteries out of electric vehicles and then be able to repurpose them into static batteries for commercial and industrial. So yeah, look, I'm very much. It's a very good question, but I think it's part of this the challenge that we have.
I'll probably it's along the same path. I hear conflicting issues about. Well, certainly there's people in terms of cars talking about issues in terms of they didn't last quite as long. But on the flip side, you see, I've seen stats that sort of say, oh no, these things are actually lasting longer than expected in a lot of cases, and so the well beyond the warranty periods. I'd be interested to hear which side of that you come down on, and where you think the there's obviously different quality between different batteries, but in general, whether how long you should sort of factor into your numbers for batteries that you're buying today.
Well, I'd be hesitant to give you specific advice, but everyone's had that experience, right? You've got a mobile phone; it's the same technology. The battery starts to degrade over a couple of years. The technology does. The lithium cells. I'm not a chemist, but they do degrade, and it's something where we'll have to factor in. It was something that will become, I guess, a factor for warranties in those certainly in those products, and looking at ways that those products can be cycled out, that they become part of your maintenance schedule for that vehicle, for example.
Yep. So sorry, it sounds like you avoided that question though. Like I'm interested in. Do you think so the average warranty is well, I guess on a home battery, what is it, sort of 8 or 9 years at the moment, or beyond?
Yeah, look, it depends. There's two parts. Part of it is the hardware. So for solar panels, the panel life is sort of, you can comfortably get, it's 10 years, but you comfortably get 20 years. The inverters, good inverters are 10 years. Inverters are lasting about 10 years. For the cheaper inverters, you'll be at 5 years. For batteries, I don't actually have up-to-date numbers on the actual battery component. The inverter would be about the same. A good inverter, you would get 10 years, but I'm not sure. I actually, I need to.
Yeah. Okay. No,
I'll have a look
fine.
up on the actual cells. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No worries. So in terms of we spoke a little bit about, we started to talk about the different battery technologies between cars versus houses. I mean, have you got thoughts on any of that, or is that sort of not really an area you guys delve into in terms of, because I guess what we've heard from others is that while they're both sort of lithium certainly playing a dominant role in both, but the actual technologies, because on the car side, you need to get a lot of energy out very quickly, whereas on the house side, it's actually about getting energy out much more slowly, and so you can different technologies are better for depending upon which one you want to do.
Yeah, look, and this is not my area of expertise, but my understanding is really there's a composition in the cell production, and then there is really the electronics that are associated with the battery discharge are really optimizing for their different use. So as you say, except if you need the acceleration in the car, but if you actually want to optimize over a longer period of time, but clearly in the car, the fast charging of those batteries, so not actually the actual use of that battery, but how quickly you can get them back to full, has really driven a lot of the chemistry and the electronics around that. And so we see that, fast chargers really trying to get to, how do you get to 80% full in a short amount of time, knowing that to get to 100%, it's got quite a tail on it. My understanding, though, is that there's different composition in the chemistry, that largely we're talking about the same real type of cells that are being utilised. Tesla, for example, is really using the same kind of cells in their small household things they call power walls through to their power packs, which are these mega batteries, as well as in their cars. Yep. There's a number of other materials that may come in, but I think that they're a longer scale that we'll see any of those other technologies really coming in at a consumer or a customer, a household level over the next 5 years.
Okay, so maybe we should divert back then more about the nature of the electricity grid. There's, I guess, one take on this is that we're headed for a decentralized electricity grid, where it becomes a lot more sort of microgrids of tens of thousands of people, and you can share batteries and all that type of stuff, but that's probably enough. You don't need to run big cables right across the country in order to hook these up. And another view is that no, look, this will you take advantage of the power of the sun moving east to west, and you stick up a bunch of solar panels in the middle of the country that can help run Sydney when it's as the sun's going down, and you tap in wind power from all around the country. So the wind's probably not going to be, it probably is going to be blowing somewhere in the country, and so you have this sort of this more I guess nationalized grid versus the smaller ones. I guess, where do you see and where are you guys pitching your technology to sort of with those two different models?
Yeah, so we're a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B. So actually, where our technology applies is in major grids. I'd done some previous work in microgrid technology, but our technology really applies in really large grids, like the Australian National Electricity Market. That's strings from North Queensland across to Port Augusta. The fundamentals really come back to that supply and demand. So if we come right back down to the household level, to actually supply your house with a high percentage of its own power is becoming within reach. But 100% is a really big number. There's a really big gap between 80 and 90%, and even 95% and 100%.
Yep. And actually, can I just to clarify, that's because you want to make sure that you can power your house when the sun hasn't shone for a couple of days and the wind hasn't blown, and so you actually need way more capacity than
exactly.
Exactly.
Okay. And so you'll get to a point, even if you were getting to 95%, to do that, you'll have way too much during summer, and maybe not quite enough. It'll be the equivalent of range anxiety at home, saying, I hope I can power power my Netflix this evening.
Yes.
Where I live in Melbourne, we don't need to do that. There's a lot of programs I've been involved in over a period of time of doing that as a demonstration. I think to demonstrate that technology is working, motivations to be able to be 100% renewable from your own generation is certainly, I appreciate that aspiration. But if we're talking about scale, if we're talking about shifting functional grids to 100% renewables, the infrastructure that we have, the poles and wires that we have, can carry green electrons just as well as they can carry fossil fuel electrons down the pipe. Very interconnected grids are actually a great thing. It's a great way that if I'm not at home, my solar can be being used across industry. It can be charging someone else's electric vehicle down the street. So interconnected grids are actually a really critical part of managing the variability of renewable energy and are a critical utilisation of existing infrastructure. Now, the difference, though, is for some remote and regional communities, the technology that we have now that is quite cost competitive for solar and batteries means that it may be cheaper for some of those communities to actually disconnect that infrastructure and avoid the long-term maintenance of large distribution connections to those systems.
And so roughly, how many people do you think that it takes to sort of click over to that level in terms of where you'd start to say, okay, the fact that, I'm at home using my stuff, but you're out and, somebody else is, is it sort of 10,000 people, or do you need sort of 100,000 people, or is it 1,000 people? What's the sort of scale?
It's a combination of that community's capacity to actually generate enough electricity. So it's got to either have the panels on the roof, it's got to jointly invest in its own wind farm, combined with the cost benefit of that existing infrastructure provider working with that community to say, actually, you know what? I'm happy to help you operate your local grid. And what we'll do is we'll cut the cord. And so this is a very current conversation in Western Australia. So Western Power, who operates Greater Perth area, they've got 1 million residential customers, about a number of sites, but also have quite regional areas that they still service through what we call long skinny lines. They're, a line that might be 200, 300 kilometres long that's exposed to and vulnerable to, being knocked over in a storm, all of those types of things. That utility is now working with communities to say, well, how can we maintain that supply obligation that we have? That's that 100% on or 99% on. But instead of continuing to reinvest in this old infrastructure, that we put that into renewable generation and storage programs with the community. I think in that case, it really does need that combination.
How many people though are they targeting? Because is that just it could be 100 people, it could be 1,000 people.
In some cases it would be. I think they're in both those sizes. There's 100 people, 1,000 people, but it really does depend on the proximity, the distance of that infrastructure, its status. Those things will really combine into the overall business case.
Right. And so I guess I guess the logical steps in my mind anyway sort of go, well, if it makes sense to do that for a remote community today, and then you sort of move into at today's prices, and let's say battery costs come, they've come down 90% in the last sort of 10, 15 years, and let's say they halve over the next 10, 15 years, maybe then it starts to become into I don't know, pick a maybe Wagga Wagga or something like that. You go, oh well, now it makes sense to have them isolated on their own. And then as you sort of get bigger and bigger, it's like, okay, maybe do we need a link between Sydney, Melbourne? Like that sort of seems to me that the logic is moving towards more decentralized and just saying, don't run these wires. Or do you think there will actually be this need to say, no, we still need a wire between Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, North Queensland, because just in case, the wind doesn't blow in South Australia and they need to pull in energy, and just in case they have, a dozen wet weeks maybe 2 wet weeks in a row in Sydney, and we need to ship the power the other way.
Well, I think it comes back to the point we were talking about before, is it's really within touch to be able to supply the majority of your needs, but it becomes really expensive to supply all of your needs. And so, look, I'm a real advocate of putting solar on your roof and a battery down the side of your house. But I really like the idea that I'm going to be buying wind from, down the west coast of Victoria. That's all quite fine. And I'm quite appreciative of the fact that that's probably going to be cheaper than me investing in 100% generation.
Tripling the size of your battery.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, we've seen a really strong uptake in solar, but they do become set and forget technologies. I think vehicles, we have a totally different relationship, very much more emotional relationship, a much more dependent for lifestyle relationship with our car. But we still do have, I think the drivers are still, I think for most consumers is having affordable and reliable electricity. And increasingly knowing that you're doing the right thing, that it's green. Now, you can guarantee it's greener if you've got the panel on your roof. But if you're working with, a retailer that is providing you a service, it's able to get you a good price for that. Then I think that really works out. And ultimately, where we've got urban density, the connectivity of grids, the ability to import from larger scale renewable sites where we have got a fundamental scale of economy for both generation from solar and wind or large scale batteries, will be a significant part of the story, because it's not just about where we go to sleep at night. It's actually powering our businesses. It's powering our industry. We really do that. The residential use is a big part in some parts of the day, but it's not the full story, and certainly not the full story if Australia wants to retain a manufacturing base.
Well, that was where my next question was leading to for this. So let's say you were, let's say I want to set myself up something quite intensive in terms of electricity. Say it's a steel recycling or aluminium or something like that. I'm saying to you, come and consult for me. Should I just go and build my own fleet of, I can stick this out in the country somewhere. Should I go and build my own fleet of solar panels and just run it during the day and and a bit during the night, and just if it's not sunny, I'll take the pain on that one, or should I actually go and make sure I'm hooked up to the rest of the grid and making sure that I've got, I guess there's a trade-off between me saying yes, I can go and build this and just produce it with really cheap energy for myself when that's available, and if it's not available, I'll go, oh, well, I just won't produce as much, versus actually saying no, I need to go and spend more money to say yes, I can produce, as you said, 80% of what I need most of the time, and then every now and again I'll just have to run off the grid for the other 20% of the time.
Look, I think the same principles apply, depending on how critical your production is and how flexible it is. So we've seen traditionally, when we've gone through heat waves in Australia over the last couple of years, we have a demand response program. There's a reliability requirement that on those days where we're fully maxed out, there's just literally not enough generation supply to meet the demand driven by air conditioning. We've asked and paid contracted large industrial sites to turn off. And then when it's all gone really bad, we've turned around to the smelter and said, hey, can you drop off for an hour? Now, typically for those large productions, that's a very expensive thing to do, depending on the industry. And certainly for smelters, you just can't turn them off for too long. It stops melting. It gets, and then
takes a long time to start back up again.
Then you're in big trouble. But as we move to the potential to automate those systems that aren't reliant on necessarily aligning with a shift for workers or various things, we've got our flexibility, then we will start to see that. Now, one of the great things we have in Australia is it's really sunny in the middle of the day, and that kind of fits our kind of human work, time frame. What we'll see if hydrogen starts to build as an export business will really be driven by, the production of those plants will ramp up inherently and ramp down depending on the solar generation. It becomes a question for a lot of companies. We're seeing a real shift for larger industries that are looking to do long-term power purchase agreements with wind farms. That's been able to secure the ability to make the investment case for those infrastructure costs up front, as opposed to you build a big solar farm and geez, you hope the market plays the way that you set the forecast out. So I think we have a combination of where those industries will reach, increasingly reaching those power purchase agreements as business-to-business transactions to provide that supply, just like you might have supply of any other inputs to your production.
So in terms of the, obviously we're going through this big build out at the moment of the lots of solar power coming on, lots of solar farms as well, and wind farms. In terms of the people actually installing, I guess the large scale ones, do you think there's is there any of these companies out there that you think are making a name for themselves in that, or is that still quite a disaggregated market as well? Like, so not the residential one, but the actual the industrial scale size.
Well, certainly, like in the big paddocks, the very big spreads, very much the big infrastructure companies are in that space. A lot of a combination of large infrastructure companies and private equity globally are really buying into those programs, or rather, we're seeing a lot of that across Australia in consolidation. There's a combination, though, where large asset management companies are looking at these projects and saying there's a couple of factors that we're at the moment. So long-term forecast says that we're going to keep going this way. We have a couple of conundrums, though, for that investment. One is obviously policy certainty in Australia, which has been an ongoing issue around climate policy and its interrelation to renewable energy. One is getting the systems actually getting connected. So we built our infrastructure to take the generation to where it's needed. All of our transmission was really built around the source of our coal mining, either in the Hunter Valley or in the Latrobe Valley down here in Victoria. And so transmission connections has been a big issue, and the congestion of basically everyone trying to get their solar system on at the same time has been a blocker. And the third one has been that while we've had these large-scale systems, especially for solar, wind is a bit more immune to this a bit because of, it can be windy at night as well. But the large-scale solar systems are now getting actually constrained. The experience we've had in South Australia just in the last 2 months is that there has been such a significant amount of electricity that the spot market price has been negative for considerable amounts of the day. And so that's quite a new phenomenon. Really, what happens if you're an electricity retailer and you have a large amounts of residential systems, it means that you're paying for their electricity that's being exported into the grid. And the average cost we've estimated last year is about $250 per household that's got an average 5 kilowatt size system. If you're a large scale solar generator during that time, you really need to drop your system off. Because you're not making money. You're obliged to pay if you're connected, and so you want to avoid beating in. And so those issues we'll see start to emerge because they're really unsettling some people's long-term forecasts for those large-scale sites. Yeah. And we'll further drive that story about having a battery is not just wanting to sell when there's a high price, but actually wanting to store it when there's a lower negative price.
Yeah, I guess in my mind, that straight away says to me that that's subsidizing my battery. Like if I'm one of those guys, the deeper that negative that becomes, all of a sudden, maybe the battery technology turns into, yes, it's coming down in cost, but it doesn't need to come down as far in cost because it's almost you've got this extra tax on production that's going to improve the economics for you.
Yeah, look, and I think one of the interesting things we'll see is certainly during those what we call minimum demand, but those periods during the middle of the day when we've got high solar generation, is that you can charge your electric car for free. But one of the things that I think will start to emerge actually is that hot water will become the way to heat up your hot water system will be an electric system, and you'll heat up your hot water during the daytime. And those kind of purchases at a consumer level will be be quite interesting to see how that starts to replace.
But so, I mean, how far away are we from actually being able to do proper time of day across Australia, though? So it seems to me that it's still relatively niche in terms of having everything set up to be a time of day pricing, or am I wrong in that in terms of?
We're very close. It's something. So our technology and others are working on how do you make the things plug and play. So you need ultimately we've actually got a really clear market signal. It's a screaming market signal now.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the last year or so, but that signal's not getting through to the battery, or the battery doesn't exist yet. It's not getting through to that solar panel to say, hey, maybe you want to stop exporting in the home now and charge your electric vehicle if you've got one, or just switch off for now, because that really is, there's two things that need to happen, but I think we will start to see this roll out in the next 2 years, is getting the connectivity. That's the area that we're involved in, to actually be able to plug the things in and have them responsive. And then there's the products, the actual tariff structures from retailers to customers that need to build. And those two things go hand in hand. Retailer needs to have confidence that the household system is going to be responsive. The customer needs to have something that's simple and makes sense, and they feel like they've got trust that this purchase that they've invested in is actually, they're getting a fair deal out of it.
Well, I know, but so I guess when I'm asking that question is, it seems to me still, and I don't know if I'm mischaracterizing the most of Australia, but I still thought that most of the Australian electricity relied on somebody turning up and having a look at a meter or at least sort of going, okay, over a 3-month period, your meter's gone from, or 1 month period, your meter's gone from this to this, and so here's your bill, as opposed to going, oh no, we're not charging anything during the day. If you want to run your dishwasher, then set your dishwasher or your clothes machine to run at the middle of the day, then that's fine. You can have that for free. And then if you want to run your dryer at 6 o'clock at night, we're going to charge you extra on it. But it feels like we're a long way away from that. Like it's been spoken about for a long time. But
yeah, look, not too far. We're really not too far, because there has been a number of pricing structures, because which you can do if you've got a smart meter in your home, which across Victoria we have. You can actually.
So what proportion have a smart meter of houses now?
So in Victoria, something like 95% of homes have smart meters. But you're certainly right. The data is there, but the two things that happen, we haven't necessarily had the retailer deals that have necessarily matched that, and there's a number of reasons why they haven't driven that. But we haven't had it. It hasn't been easy for the household as well. So I'm an energy nerd. I'm right into this stuff, but I don't run around and switch things on and off. I don't look at my electricity data. It's just pay the bill once a month. My wife pays it. It's not a. I think there is a need and a capability when you have technology to have that set and forget. But there's a need to sort of know that it's actually, you're getting a good deal. Now, to give you an example, though, in a lot of other states, the smart meters are now weren't mandated to be rolled out as they have been in Victoria. But every time you put in a solar system, you need to upgrade to a smart meter now. So we're starting to put the technologies in. There's a program that started in South Australia in January this year that requires every new solar system to be installed to be actually registered digitally, and to be able to be turned down remotely across the internet, if you will, to avoid an emergency situation where the system might go black. The same program is being introduced in Western Australia from the middle of February, and we're likely to see those types of programs here in Victoria and Queensland over the next 24 months. What that does is starts to get the technology as a requirement, that it's there as part of that install process. What that allows, though, is it gives that capability now for those customers to actually turn around and be able to provide that same functionality that's required in an emergency situation to a retailer to respond to a pricing, or, a high or low pricing event at the same time.
But that sounds to me as if, well, we're 5 to 10 years away at least from realistically having a broad roll. Like, I guess if you're saying that's just being introduced on new builds, well, I don't know, you're probably 20 years away from having saturation of that market.
So this is new installs of solar.
New installs, sorry, new installs.
Not
sorry.
new homes. Yeah. So we're talking about a couple of 100,000 systems each year that would have that requirement.
And if your inverters are lasting 10 years, then you sort of got a 10-year cycle. Am I right?
It's true. It's a mandated requirement. What we work with the major inverter manufacturers globally, where we've got partnerships with each of them. We're confident we can actually go back to systems that are in the field. So to give you an example, the systems that we could reach in partnership with is about 1 million systems that are out of those 3 million solar panels can actually be contacted without a site visit. So there's a latent potential there of that ability to start to register those existing systems. But going forward, we're increasingly sort of mandating that functionality is enabled during that point of install.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, and I just want to sort of make sure I've got this right, because I guess I look upon this as a there's a lot of companies that are very heavily involved in this industry, and as we're looking to invest and trying to work out where we're best to put our money, the question comes down to time frame, and it seems to me that sort of over the next sort of 5 years, we'll hit this stage where batteries start to become a bit of a no-brainer for everyone, in the same way that solar did. That it's based on the falls we have, and I guess some of the technological changes. But it also sounds as if we're at least probably 5 to 10 years away from having that broad scale electricity systems really set up to be trading it properly. Is that? And so it doesn't sound like an imminent issue, but it's certainly, it's a relentless issue, but it's not, we're not hitting sort of any major major changes in the way that they're operating over the next couple of years. Would that be?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the timeframes are probably a bit shorter, but you're right. The drivers at the moment from a hardware equipment perspective is that it's cheaper, it's getting cheaper, and it makes sense to reduce how much electricity you buy from the grid, fundamentally. The ability to use those systems to trade into the grid and get a really good deal, that's an immature space. That's where we work with a number of technologies to really bring that to a mass scale. The change that we're seeing, though, is that the system technology to be able to do that is starting to be mandated now.
Yes.
Into things. So you go from having if we use the old systems were like an old analog TV, then we all got a set-top box to be able to get digital TV. But now the equipment that you buy, if you bear with me on the analogy, the TV that you buy from JB Hi-Fi now is internet enabled. You can watch Netflix on it out of the box. And so technology capability to have the smarts to be able to do that is really starting to get baked in. And as I was saying, jurisdictions are starting to mandate that capability for those investments. There's a big question about the maturity of our market, which is really a big question around the policies and the regulations that work through those types of things. But I'd argue on the fundamentals, though, if we continue, which we will, because it's a systemic change, to have the negative pricing that we've had across each of the jurisdictions this year. I think that's really caught a lot of people by surprise. And if you times $250 per household by 3 million households that have got solar in Australia, that starts to become larger numbers that will start to shift, really start to shift the deals. Now, they might be a little bit clunky, the way that those offers come through to households in the next year or two, but that we'll really see that those types of offers really grow for households.
Right. Okay. So the big change. So headed to sort of, as I said, maybe free electricity during the day. Whatever, 11 till 3, free electricity, and then right.
And so if I'm a retailer, then I'd be saying, well, you can charge your car for free. I've got a really great deal on this new hot water system. If you want to replace your old tank out the back, and you can charge that for free during the day as well.
Yeah. Right. Okay. And then as well, the acceleration of the battery, because they're saying it's no longer just about the cost of the battery coming down. It's now that the fact that these guys are going to want to start putting batteries in so that they don't have negative costs. So they don't have,
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah, Bruce, I've just got one other question.
Mm.
So are there any new technologies that the general public might not sort of be aware about that are likely to come to the market in the next few years, or any really significant sort of enhancements to the existing sort of green renewables?
So I'm really at the end of the stuff where the technology is pretty mature, and it's about how does it scale. So I don't have that really good over the horizon goggles for anyone, unfortunately. But I do. I mean, I do think I do keep coming back to the impacts of electric vehicles. Will be a profound thing. It's a very big. I mean, they're a very big part of consumer spend around lifestyle, but what happens with that electric vehicle when it becomes your power station as well? It will start to become a very material impact on the grid. A lot of the other stuff, I think, in a technology perspective, what we do is focus on the big lumpy things. So it's the big things that either generate, like a solar panel on your roof, can store it, could use it, like an air conditioner or an electric vehicle or a hot water system, where we're focused on in terms of that benefit for the customer's overall energy consumption, as well as the impact that they have collectively across the grid. But within that, there's all sorts of smart bits and pieces. But I do think, rather than a transformative technology, I think there's a lot of people betting on an extension of electrification. So everything will go all electric. We'll switch off gas for heating, and gas for hot water, and ultimately gas for cooking. And so it will be technologies that are able to work in that space. Hot water heat pumps, I think, will continue to drive beyond just having split systems, which has become a standard Australian way of life, into the split system for your heat pump for your hot water will be pretty dominant, I think, in the next 5 years.
Excellent. Some great insights there. Before we get into the investment implications, if there's any final viewer questions, please drop them in the chat box below. And Damien, I'll hand it over to you for the investment implications.
Yeah, sure. Actually, let me think about that for 1 minute. I just want to. I'm still digesting a couple of things you just said. Maybe Bruce. Actually, maybe do you want to go to Bruce on where, if they're interested in more info or about what you guys are up to, and sort of letting know what your how people can reach you if they're interested.
Yeah, sure. Look, so a bit of background. We're a technology company. We're based in Melbourne. We provide we're providing really services to utilities and partnering with those global brands that are starting to become household names. Companies like Tesla on the battery side, the major inverter manufacturers globally, to provide them with connectivity. If you're interested in our technology or others, certainly check out our website. And certainly in this space, there's a number of great Australian technologies. There's technologies that are supported by ARENA, the agency that's responsible at government level. There's probably an interesting one for investors to sort of look to and look at the trends of the types of technologies in the renewable space, into biofuels, hydrogen, that may be of interest, to look at a bit further at that, what's next on the horizon.
Good
Excellent.
stuff. Good stuff.
So Sam, I think I'll do an abbreviated one, because I've actually got a post on this that I'm going to be putting up over the next couple of days, that hopefully sort of a bit more information for people. Just sort of running through some of the costs. I mean, we've taken the view over a number of years now is that, you know, it really is just about watching these costs come down, and that you'd start actually hitting the point in the next sort of 5 to 10 years where the marginal cost. So at the moment we look at the cost of electricity, and you're weighing up how much does it cost to stick a solar power system in with a battery on a utility scale versus the cost of running a cost of setting up a say a coal-fired power plant or a gas-fired power plant. And we've well past that point now in terms of the costs there. But in the next sort of 5 years or so, if costs keep going the same way they're going, and especially now I need to factor in this negative prices we've been talking about today, is it actually gets to the stage where the cost of setting up a brand new solar plus sticking in some batteries is actually lower than just the fuel cost for some of these power plants. And it actually starts to get to the point where you start saying, you know, because the argument for a lot of these was, well, I've already set this power plant up, I've already done the big cost was a capital cost, and now I've just got to keep, you know, I may as well just keep the thing running for the rest of its life. But if it gets to the stage where you can actually say, well, no, it's rather than spending, you know, $100 a ton on coal, it's actually better for me it's actually cheaper for me than just this running cost to go and stick a solar plus battery farm in. Then, yeah, that actually makes some quite significant changes to how you view some of these electrical investments. You know, we've taken the view that the technology is difficult in terms of trying to pick the winners, in that there are so many different moving parts in terms of either even, you know, when you look at solar technology, whether you've got thin film solar, which is not very efficient, but it's very cheap in terms of actually putting it on places, versus you get some really high efficiency ones, but they're a lot more expensive, and trying to work out, you know, which is better, which is worse, and which one's going to be the winner. Given the multiple different technologies, and the same in the battery space, is actually picking winners becomes quite difficult. And we've been focusing on trying to work out who the losers are, which we think is a lot easier to pick in terms of going through some of the traditional companies and looking at ones where you can't see that you know, how much life they have to it. So that's where we've sort of been focused, is on clearing out stocks out of the portfolios that we think are going to be losers, rather than trying to find ones to add in. We've got a couple of stocks who are involved in especially in the international area, in terms of ones that are involved in the electrification process itself. So less about the actual producing the goods or producing the solar panels or producing the batteries, and more about the ones that are providing services around plugging those into the networks, and actually you know, helping that interconnectivity issue, because that's one where at least we think we can see a business model that is more likely to survive. Whereas, as I said, trying to pick which technology is going to be the winner is a bit more difficult from that front. So that's sort of the broad base. But yeah, I've got a piece coming out over the next week that'll dig quite deeply into. It'll be probably end up being 3 pieces, I think. One on the electricity side, one on the and the generation, another one on the electric vehicle side. Just working out where the crossover is there and how far away we are from that. And then lastly, on the hydrogen side, where it was obviously getting lots of hype on the hydrogen at the moment. And I do think there are a lot of genuine uses for hydrogen, but I do think there's I think there's probably more hype than what there is than yeah. Anyway, I'll go into more detail on that later. I think there's parts of it that are just overhyped in terms of the hydrogen side, and I think there's actually more scope for me for I think batteries have a much better have a much better future. People have, in some cases, people are putting forward use cases for hydrogen, which basically involves taking electricity, turning it into hydrogen and losing lots on the way, and then taking the hydrogen and burning it, losing lots more power just to get it back into producing electricity. And you're like, stick it in a battery. You save yourself all the losses of creating hydrogen and all the losses of getting it back. And so, yeah, anyway, I'll delve more into detail on a series of posts coming out over the next week or so.
Thanks for that, Damien. Yeah, some great insights as always, and I'm sure everyone's looking forward to seeing that content when it comes out. So now we have the question of the week. So this is for viewers to drop into the comments and have a bit of discussion amongst yourselves, and Yeah, so the question is, what changes in energy do you think will be most profound? So what changes in energy do you think will be most profound? So yeah, feel free to post in the comments, have some discussion, get some discussion going. So that almost wraps us up. So thanks for joining us today, Damien and Bruce. Thanks again to everyone who's watched this episode live and to all those that have asked questions along the way or watched the replay. We do welcome your feedback on the show, especially in regards to suggestions for future topics. If you do have any ideas, please drop it in the YouTube comments section below or send us an email at contact@nucleuswealth.com. Don't forget to like the video now. And finally, if you know of anyone that might benefit from this today's episode, we'd appreciate it if you share it with them. Please check out our website at nucleuswealth.com. And if you'd like to see some more of our previous content, head over to nucleuswealth.com/content. To stay up to date with news from us, you can also follow us on social media. Thanks again for tuning in. For myself, Damien, Bruce, and the rest of the team, we look forward to seeing you again at the next episode, and bye for now.